Late one ordinary evening at Kensington Palace, Princess Margaret sat at her dressing table, while her dresser unclasped the diamonds from her neck, and in a flat, quiet voice, the public smile already gone, she said the sentence that woman would carry for decades: "I was never meant to be happy. If this account has been useful, subscribing costs nothing, and more stories like this one are queued. The bell notification means you will see them." It was not a joke, not a performance. Margaret was the wittiest woman in any room she entered, and this was neither of her famous modes. It was a verdict, a judgment she had reached about her own existence, and she handed it to a servant precisely because a servant did not count, because the one person in the room she did not have to perform for was the one paid to be invisible. The world knew a different Margaret, the glamorous rebel, the sister of the Queen who lit up every gathering, who sang, who mimicked, who stayed later than anyone and laughed the loudest. But the dresser saw the switch. The moment the door shut and the last guest was gone, the smile did not fade. It went out, like a lamp, and the woman behind it was quiet and still, and somewhere else entirely. Margaret Rose was born in 1930, the second daughter, the spare to her sister Elizabeth, and by every account, she was the gifted one. Quicker, funnier, more musical. The child who could play the piano and imitate the grown-ups and hold a whole room without trying. If talent were a throne, it would have been hers. Remember that sentence. Everything that follows is the answer to why she believed it. Then, in 1936, the ground moved under both girls. Their uncle, Edward VIII, abdicated to marry a divorced American woman, and in a single stroke their gentle stammering father became King George VI. Elizabeth, 10 years old, became heir to the throne. Margaret became something with no name and no job. The country now had a future queen and a spare. One girl was handed a purpose that would define the century. The other was handed the glamour, the cameras, the curtsies, and nothing at all to do with any of it. You know her as the party princess with the cigarette holder. The woman who dressed her every morning knew someone else. And here is the quiet engine of the whole story. A person with no role of her own has only one place left to pour a life into, and that is another person. Margaret was allowed to be decorative. She was allowed to be charming. The one thing she was ever truly allowed to want was someone to want. So when she finally did fall, she fell with everything she had, because there was nothing else to spend it on. His name was Peter Townsend, Group Captain Peter Townsend, her father's equerry, a Battle of Britain pilot with a chest of medals and a steadiness the whole palace trusted. He was 16 years older. He was quietly, deeply in love with her, and she with him. There was only one problem, and it was the kind the crown never forgives. Peter Townsend was a divorced man, so in 1955, the church and the government sat the young princess down and handed her a choice no human being should ever have to make. Keep the man, or keep her rank, her income, and her place in the family. She kept her place in the family. In 1955, she issued a statement ending it, saying she was mindful of the church's teachings, and with those few careful words, she handed Peter Townsend back to the world and walked away. The sentence was polished. She was not. Staff who saw her in the days that followed said she moved through the palace like someone rehearsing a life she no longer wanted. She turned up where she was meant to be. She smiled where a smile was required, and the instant a door shut behind her, the smile went with it, like a light switched off at the wall. So she reached for a second act. In 1960, she married the photographer Anthony Armstrong-Jones, Lord Snowdon, and for a while it genuinely looked as though the fairy tale had simply been paused and started up again. He was clever. He was quick. He photographed her the way she wanted to be seen. The country watched the wedding and decided the sad chapter was over. It was not over. It curdled. Friends who were often in the house described screaming rows that carried down the corridors, and something colder underneath the shouting. There were notes. Cruel little notes, they said, left on tables and tucked into books for the other one to find. A list of her faults, waiting by the bed. Affairs on both sides, conducted almost openly, each of them punishing the other for a happiness neither could reach. The room that had looked like a rescue became a cage with better lighting. In 1978 it ended for good. They divorced, the first royal divorce in the modern era, and the papers treated it as a scandal and a milestone at once. Something in her changed after that. The sparkle did not go out. It hardened. The glamour stopped being joy and started being a wall she stood behind. If you have ever performed happiness for a room full of people who wanted you to be fine, you already understand exactly what she was doing. And she performed it loudly. She drank. She held that long cigarette holder up in front of her like a small, jewelled weapon, a thing to point and gesture with so no one looked too closely at the eyes above it. She went out to the island of Mustique, threw parties in the sun, held court in a bathing suit, and all but dared the newspapers to call her unhappy, which they did. In headline after headline, they called her spoiled, decadent, tragic, and she let it be known she never read a word of them. And she read everyone. Here is what the staff understood, that the readers did not. A wild princess was easy. A wild princess was a story, and stories sell, and the palace could live with a story. A sad princess was a problem. Sadness raised the wrong question. Sadness asked what had been done to her, and by whom, and why. So the grief was kept off the page, and out of the frame. The version the public got was the woman with the cigarette holder, and the tan, and the sharp tongue, because that woman was manageable. The other one, the quiet one who appeared, the moment the last guest left, stayed strictly behind the palace doors. But she was there. Watch what she keeps close when the audience finally goes home. Behind all the noise, behind the drink and the smoke and the defiant headlines she pretended not to see, there was one thing she never turned into a performance. One object she never explained. A single photograph. She kept it near her, moved it with her, and no one who dressed her, or drove her, or poured her drinks ever got a straight word about who was in it. They learned not to ask. They saw it on the dressing table, propped where she could see it, and they saw how she looked at it when she thought the room was empty. Only the people who were with her once the door was shut and the audience gone ever came close to knowing who it was and what grief it carried. They saw her the way no photographer ever did, without the makeup, without the audience, the maid who ran her bath, the footman who carried her tray, the dresser who lifted the diamonds from her neck each night. These were the people who knew which Margaret was real. There is an old truth about great houses, that the servants are the great leveller, and in her case it held. To the world, she was Her Royal Highness. To the woman who buttoned her gloves, she was simply the person in the chair, tired and far quieter than the newspapers would ever believe. You could almost set a clock by it. One of them said in later years, the car door would close, or the last guest would finally leave, and the performance switched off. The bright face, the quick laugh, the royal sparkle the crowds had come for, all of it drained out of her in a second, and what was left sat very still and said almost nothing. They learned not to fill the silence. They learned that the real Margaret only arrived once the audience had gone, and there was the photograph. She never said whose face it was. She kept it close, and when a curious eye lingered too long, she moved it, or moved the conversation somewhere safer. The staff had their own idea. They had watched her back in 1955, moving through the palace like a woman rehearsing a life she no longer wanted. They did not need telling what a person keeps and will not explain. It belonged to the love she had been made to give up, and to all the years she spent measuring everything else against it. The body went before the spirit did. In her last years the strokes came, one after another, and they took her speech and her mobility. The woman who had mimicked half of London across a dinner table could no longer shape the words. The girl who had danced every room alight was wheeled through them instead, half her face gone still, dark glasses over eyes that had taken far too much Mystique sun. The visitors thinned. The rooms at Kensington Palace went dim. She died in 2002. She was 71. The funeral, that February, was smaller and plainer than a princess of her fame might have drawn. She had asked to be cremated, unusual for the family, and her ashes were placed beside her father, King George VI. The sister who had become queen sat in the front row. The spare, seen off at last. Here is the part her staff carried for the rest of their lives. A dresser stays silent while her mistress lives. That is the whole of the job. The discretion, the closed mouth, the invisible presence at the edge of the room. So for decades the sentence sat unspoken. Only after Margaret was gone, with no one left to protect, and no rank left to guard, did the woman who had unclasped those diamonds 1,000 times give the line to a biographer. Late on an ordinary evening, at the dressing table, the smile already gone, the princess had said it in a flat, quiet voice. I was never meant to be happy, and it changes everything you thought you saw. Say the sentence again, now that you know all of it, and hear what she actually meant. The diamonds, the parties on the island, the string of men the papers so carefully counted. All of it was only the surface. Underneath sat a decision she had reached very young, that the crown had priced her joy out of reach, and that no amount of sparkle would ever buy it back. This is what the accounts add up to, once you lay them side by side. A woman who concluded, early and for good, that the family's image would always cost more than her own happiness was worth, and who then spent the rest of her life proving herself right, in front of the only people in the world who were watching and never told. So go back to where it started, the mirrored table, the hands at her neck, lifting the weight of the diamonds away, the public smile already gone the instant the door clicked shut. It was never self-pity. It was a verdict, handed down quietly, night after night, to the one person in the room who never mattered enough to lie to. I was never meant to be happy.